Still, when the entire dining room had already gone quiet, with the particular embarrassment of watching someone be turned away, a young waiter stood at the entrance of an upscale restaurant, telling an elderly man in a worn, threadbare coat that the establishment maintained a dress code the man's clothing simply did not meet. Nobody in that restaurant, not the manager watching from across the room, not the other diners pretending not to notice, understood yet why the waiter's entire demeanor would shift the moment the old man, fumbling apologetically, opened his wallet and a faded photograph slipped free, landing face up on the host stand between them. The waiter's name was Desmond. He was 26 years old, working the evening shift at Averill, one of the city's most exclusive fine dining establishments, a job he had held for the past 2 years while saving carefully toward culinary school tuition he could not yet fully afford. The old man's name was Cornelius, 79 years old, a widower who had walked nearly 2 miles that evening from the modest apartment he had lived in for the past decade, dressed in the best clothing he owned, though the years had not been kind to the fabric. The sleeves worn thin, the collar frayed at the edges in ways no amount of careful pressing could fully disguise. Before we go any further, if you believe that dignity does not depend on the condition of a person's clothing, and that the smallest object in someone's wallet can sometimes carry the weight of an entire lifetime, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded to look twice before making assumptions about a stranger. Now, back to the story. Cornelius had come to Averill that evening for a specific, deeply personal reason that Desmond, following the restaurant's strict dress code policy exactly as his manager had trained him, had no way of knowing when he first greeted the old man at the entrance. 53 years earlier, on the exact date that evening's calendar marked, Cornelius had brought his wife, Adelina, to that same restaurant, then operating under a different name but occupying the very same building, for their very first proper date, an evening neither of them had ever been able to afford again in the decades of modest, hard-working life that followed, but one that had remained, throughout their entire 50-year marriage, the single most treasured memory either of them carried. Adelina had passed away 8 months earlier, and Cornelius, navigating a grief so profound it had left him barely able to manage the ordinary tasks of daily living, had decided, in the weeks leading up to their anniversary, that he needed to return to that exact restaurant one final time, to sit at whatever table might be available, to order whatever modest item his limited pension could afford, simply to feel close to her memory, in the one place that had meant more to their 50-year love story than anywhere else in the world. He had not anticipated the restaurant's transformation over the decades into the kind of exclusive establishment that maintained strict dress codes, valet parking, and a reservation system that assumed guests understood implicitly what standards were expected of them. He had simply walked the 2 miles from his apartment, dressed in his best remaining clothes, carrying in his coat pocket the small, careful savings he had set aside specifically for this one evening, hoping only to sit quietly at a table and remember. Desmond, greeting him at the entrance, had followed his training precisely, explaining with the practiced, professional courtesy the restaurant required of its staff, that Averill maintained a formal dress code that, unfortunately, Cornelius's current attire did not meet, offering, as policy dictated, to recommend several other nearby establishments that might better accommodate him that evening. Before we continue, we want to pause here, because what happened next unfolded with a gentleness that surprised everyone who witnessed it. Cornelius, visibly embarrassed but not angry, began to apologize, explaining haltingly that he understood, that he should have realized the restaurant had changed since he last visited, reaching into his coat pocket for his wallet as he spoke, perhaps out of some old habit of needing to hold something familiar during an uncomfortable moment. As he opened it, a small, worn photograph, its edges softened by decades of handling, slipped loose and fell, face up, onto the host stand between them. Desmond glanced down instinctively and found himself looking at a faded black and white photograph of a young couple, the man unmistakably a much younger version of Cornelius, standing in front of the very entrance where they now stood, the restaurant's original signage visible in the background, both figures beaming with the particular unguarded joy of people at the very beginning of something they did not yet know would last 50 years. Cornelius, noticing Desmond's attention shift to the photograph, offered a small, sad smile and explained, briefly and without any expectation, that it would change the outcome of the conversation, that the photograph had been taken outside this same restaurant on his and his late wife's first date, 53 years earlier, to that very evening, and that he had simply wanted, one final time, to sit somewhere close to that memory. Desmond, 26 years old and only 2 years into a career built almost entirely around following exacting rules and procedures precisely, found himself facing a decision that no portion of his training had ever adequately prepared him for. He excused himself briefly, photograph still resting on the host stand, and walked directly to his manager, a woman named Priyanka, who had run Averell's front-of-house operations for nearly a decade. What followed was a conversation that several kitchen staff, overhearing fragments of it through the service door, would later describe as one of the more remarkable exchanges they had witnessed during their time at the restaurant. Desmond explained the situation quickly. The anniversary, the photograph, the grief evident in the old man's careful, halting explanation, and asked Priyanka directly whether an exception could be made. Just this once, understanding fully that he was asking her to set aside a policy she had always enforced without exception. Priyanka, listening, walked to the entrance herself, looked at the photograph still resting on the host stand, and then looked at Cornelius, standing quietly, still faintly embarrassed, clearly prepared to simply leave without further protest. She made her decision within seconds, telling Cornelius, with a warmth that visibly startled him, that Averell would be honored to have him back for the evening, dress code notwithstanding, and personally escorted him to the best table in the house, a quiet corner near the window that, she explained, happened to be the closest surviving table to where the restaurant's original layout had once placed its most romantic corner booth, decades before extensive renovations had reshaped the dining room. Before we go further, we want to acknowledge the quieter history behind that photograph, a history neither Desmond nor Priyanka knew in full detail that evening, but one that had shaped everything Cornelius carried into that dining room. Adelina, in the decades since that first date, had kept the photograph in her own wallet for most of their marriage, only recently transferring it to Cornelius's keeping during the final months of her illness, telling him, in one of their last clear conversations, that she wanted him to have it, to remember, whenever the grief became too heavy, exactly how their entire life together had begun. None of the restaurant staff had any way of knowing this deeper layer of the photograph's significance. All of it was present in that small, worn image resting on the host stand. Cornelius's meal that evening, a modest soup and a simple entree he had carefully budgeted for weeks in advance, arrived accompanied by a small dessert Priyanka had quietly instructed the kitchen to add at no charge, along with a handwritten note from the kitchen staff wishing him a peaceful evening of remembrance. Desmond himself checked on his table throughout the night, not out of any professional obligation, but because he found himself genuinely moved by the old man's quiet, dignified grief, and wanted to ensure his evening passed as gently as possible. Near the end of the meal, Cornelius asked Desmond if he might have a few minutes to talk, and what followed was a conversation that lasted nearly an hour, well past what any restaurant's normal service pacing would typically allow, Priyanka herself quietly ensuring no other staff rushed the table. Cornelius told Desmond about Adelina, about the 50 years of a marriage built not on wealth or grand gestures, but on the accumulated weight of countless, small, ordinary days spent together, raising children, weathering hardship, growing old side by side in a way that Cornelius, in the depths of his grief, still struggled to imagine his life continuing without. Desmond, listening, found himself thinking about his own grandparents, about the particular way older generations sometimes carried entire love stories in small, easily overlooked objects. A photograph, a ticket stub, a pressed flower kept between the pages of a book. He asked Cornelius, gently, whether he had family nearby who checked in on him regularly, and Cornelius admitted, with the same quiet, uncomplaining honesty he had carried throughout the evening, that his 2 adult children lived several states away, that visits had grown less frequent since Adelina's passing, and that most of his days now passed in a solitude he had not yet learned how to properly navigate. What followed over the subsequent weeks was, again, not framed by anyone involved as charity, and Cornelius, a man who had spent his entire working life valuing self-sufficiency and quiet dignity, would not have accepted it had it been framed that way. Desmond, moved by the evening's conversation, began visiting Cornelius periodically on his days off. Initially, simple check-ins that gradually developed into a genuine friendship neither of them had anticipated forming across the considerable gap in their ages and circumstances. Priyanka, for her part, quietly extended a standing invitation for Cornelius to return to Averell whenever he wished, regardless of dress code, an accommodation she made discreetly available to staff, without ever making a public announcement of the policy exception, understanding that drawing attention to it would undermine the very dignity she had sought to preserve for him that first evening. Cornelius began returning to the restaurant every few months, always seated at the same quiet corner table, always greeted warmly by whichever staff happened to be working that evening, the story of his and Adelina's 50-year love story becoming something of a gently guarded tradition among the restaurant's staff, a reminder several of them later cited as having genuinely changed how they approached every subsequent guest who did not immediately fit the establishment's typical clientele. Desmond's friendship with Cornelius deepened steadily over the following 2 years, the young waiter finding, in the old man's company, a kind of grandfatherly wisdom he had not previously had much access to in his own life, having lost his own grandparents at a young age. Cornelius, in turn, found in Desmond's regular visits a genuine antidote to the isolation that had settled over his life since Adelina's passing, a relationship that gave his days a structure and warmth he had feared. In the darkest months of his grief, he might never recover. On what would have been Cornelius and Adelina's 55th wedding anniversary, Desmond, by then promoted to assistant manager at Averell, arranged a small, private gathering at the restaurant, Priyanka and several longtime staff members present, along with Cornelius's 2 adult children, whom Desmond had gently encouraged to reconnect more regularly with their father over the preceding 2 years. Cornelius, seated once again at his familiar corner table, surrounded by people who had come to genuinely care for him, told the assembled group that he had walked into that restaurant 2 years earlier, expecting only to be turned away, and had instead found, in the most unexpected place, a small but meaningful piece of the family and connection he had feared he had permanently lost. In the days following that first evening, Priyanka found herself reflecting on the decision she had made at the entrance, recognizing that it represented a genuine departure from the strict operational standards Averell's owners had always insisted upon. She scheduled a meeting with the restaurant's ownership group, not to seek retroactive permission, but to propose a formal, quietly implemented policy allowing for discretionary exceptions in cases involving elderly guests, memorial visits, or other circumstances where rigid enforcement of dress standards might cause genuine harm to a guest's dignity. The ownership group, after some initial hesitation about setting a precedent that could be difficult to manage consistently, ultimately approved a limited version of her proposal, trusting Priyanka's judgment as the restaurant's most experienced front-of-house manager to apply it thoughtfully rather than allowing it to become a loophole. Desmond's own path toward culinary school, the goal he had been quietly saving toward throughout his 2 years at Averell, took an unexpected turn following his growing friendship with Cornelius. During one of their regular visits, Cornelius, learning of Desmond's ambitions, revealed that he had spent nearly 3 decades of his working life as a baker before retiring, running a small neighborhood bakery that had closed only after his health made the demanding early morning hours impossible to sustain. What began as casual conversation about recipes and technique gradually evolved into informal mentorship. Cornelius sharing decades of accumulated baking knowledge with a young man hungry to learn, teaching him bread techniques and pastry fundamentals that no culinary school curriculum could fully replicate, precisely because they came from a lifetime of practical, hard-won experience rather than textbook theory. Cornelius's adult children, a son named Theodore, living several states away in a demanding corporate career, and a daughter named Marisol, who had relocated for her husband's work shortly after Adelina's passing, had both struggled, in their own ways, with the guilt of geographic distance during their father's grief. Desmond's gentle encouragement, delivered not as criticism, but as genuine concern for Cornelius's well-being during their growing friendship, eventually prompted both siblings to establish a more consistent schedule of visits and phone calls. Theodore, in particular, beginning a practice of calling his father every Sunday evening, specifically to discuss whatever new baking technique Cornelius had most recently taught Desmond. A small ritual that gave their conversations a warm, specific focus neither of them had previously found easy to establish in the aftermath of their mother's death. The photograph itself, the small, worn image that had fallen from Cornelius's wallet that first evening, eventually found a permanent home in a modest frame that Priyanka commissioned as a quiet gift, placed discreetly on the wall near Cornelius's regular corner table at Averell, a small, permanent acknowledgement of the story that had unfolded there, visible only to those who knew to look for it, exactly the kind of understated tribute Cornelius himself preferred to any more public form of recognition. Marisol, visiting her father for the first time in over a year during the period following his growing friendship with Desmond, found herself deeply moved upon meeting the young waiter, who had, in her words, given her father back a sense of purpose and connection she had feared he might never recover after her mother's death. She began, in the months that followed, coordinating more closely with Theodore to ensure their father's social calendar remained full and varied, understanding now, through Desmond's example, exactly how much difference consistent, genuine companionship could make in an elderly person's daily life. 2 years after that first evening, on what would have been Cornelius and Adelina's 55th wedding anniversary, the small private gathering Desmond arranged at Averell included not just Priyanka and longtime staff members, but also several other elderly regulars who had, in the intervening years, benefited from the restaurant's quiet, discretionary approach to dress code exceptions. A small community of guests who had come to think of Averell not simply as a restaurant, but as a place that understood dignity extended well beyond the surface presentation a strict policy alone could measure. Desmond, reflecting on the 2 years since that first evening during a quiet conversation with Priyanka, shortly before the anniversary gathering, told her that he had come to understand his own culinary ambitions differently since befriending Cornelius, no longer simply pursuing technical mastery for its own sake, but hoping, eventually, to open a modest neighborhood establishment of his own. One built on exactly the kind of warm, generous hospitality that had first drawn Cornelius back through Averell's doors, and that had ultimately given both of them a friendship neither had expected, but both had come to treasure. There was a quieter detail from that original evening that few people beyond Desmond and Priyanka ever fully understood the weight of. In the moments before Cornelius opened his wallet and the photograph fell free, Desmond had already begun the practiced, professional process of redirecting him toward the exit, and had, in fact, taken half a step toward the door himself, prepared to escort the old man out with the same polite firmness his training required. It was only the sound of the photograph landing on the wooden host stand, a small, soft sound that nonetheless cut through the ambient noise of the dining room, that had made him pause and glance down before completing that redirection, a split-second decision that, had it gone differently, would have sent Cornelius back out into the cold evening with nothing but the quiet, private grief he had carried in alone. Priyanka often reflected, in later conversations with newer staff members she trained in the years following that evening, that the entire situation had hinged on that single, almost accidental pause, and that she used the story specifically to illustrate why she asked her staff to remain attentive to small, seemingly incidental details, even in the middle of following standard procedures. Because sometimes the most important information a guest offered arrived not through words, but through a small object slipping quietly into view. Cornelius's bakery, before its closure years earlier, had been a modest but beloved neighborhood institution, and several of his former customers, upon hearing through informal neighborhood channels about his renewed presence at Averell and his mentorship of a young waiter there, began occasionally stopping by the restaurant themselves, curious to see whether any of Cornelius's famous recipes had made their way, even informally, onto Averell's menu. Priyanka, delighted by this unexpected surge of goodwill, eventually arranged for Desmond to prepare a small seasonal dessert based on one of Cornelius's traditional recipes, listed on the menu simply as a tribute to a longtime friend of the restaurant, without any further explanation, a quiet nod that only those who knew the full story would ever fully understand the depth of. On the third anniversary of that first evening, Desmond, by then several months into planning his own modest neighborhood restaurant concept with Cornelius, as an informal consultant and mentor, invited Cornelius to help him test recipes in Averell's kitchen during off hours, an arrangement Priyanka happily accommodated, given how much the elderly man's presence seemed to energize the entire kitchen staff. Cornelius, working alongside Desmond at a familiar stovetop for the first time in years, told him that he had never expected, in the depths of his grief 3 years earlier, that a single evening, meant only as a quiet, private remembrance, would eventually give him back not just friendship, but a renewed sense of purpose. He had feared belonged only to his working years, long since past. Theodore, Cornelius's son, eventually relocated his family closer to his father in the years following that first evening, a decision he later credited directly to the wake-up call of watching a stranger's kindness fill a gap in his father's life that he himself had allowed distance and busy schedules to create. He took over informal management of his father's growing collection of recipes, working with Desmond to properly document them for the first time, understanding that his father's decades of practical baking knowledge represented a family inheritance worth preserving formally, rather than allowing it to exist only in memory and improvisation. Marisol, similarly, began flying in for extended visits several times a year, rather than the occasional obligatory holiday trip that had characterized her relationship with her father in the immediate aftermath of her mother's passing, and she often told friends that watching her father's friendship with Desmond unfold had taught her something important about the specific kind of attention aging parents genuinely needed. Not simply dutiful check-ins, but sustained, curious engagement with whatever still brought them joy and purpose. On the 4th anniversary of that first meeting, Averell hosted a modest celebration honoring Cornelius's ongoing contribution to the restaurant's kitchen culture. Several dishes on the seasonal menu now bearing quiet tribute to his decades of baking expertise. Cornelius, standing among staff and regulars who had come to know him well over the years, reflected that the evening he had once expected to end in quiet, private disappointment had instead become the beginning of the most unexpected and cherished chapter of his life after Adelina's passing. Proof, he said, that even in the depths of grief, an ordinary evening could still hold room for something entirely new to begin. Desmond's own restaurant concept, once it finally opened 3 years after that first evening, included a small, deliberately understated corner table near the entrance, modeled directly after Cornelius's favored spot at Averell, along with a quietly posted note, explaining that guests dressed in whatever they had, regardless of formality, would always be welcomed there with the same warmth Cornelius himself had once received. Cornelius attended the opening, standing beside Desmond as the first guests arrived, and told him, with the particular pride of a mentor watching a lesson fully realized, that he could think of no better tribute to Adelina's memory than a restaurant built on the exact principle that had once brought an old man's grief and a young waiter's compassion together on an ordinary evening neither of them ever expected to become the beginning of something so lasting. Never assume that a person's clothing tells you the full story of who they are. Never underestimate the weight a small, worn photograph can carry across decades of memory. Never dismiss dignity because it arrives dressed differently than expected. And never forget that sometimes the most important exception a person can make to their own rules is the one that allows genuine human connection to happen exactly when it is needed most. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment about the part that stayed with you longest, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness sometimes means looking past the surface of a situation. Subscribe for more stories about dignity, connection, and the unexpected friendships that change our lives in the quietest ways. Because sometimes the most meaningful evening of someone's life begins with a single, gentle decision to look twice before turning them away.